The storm came without warning. 1 minute, the skies were clear, the road was passable, and the sun hung high above in the blue, crisp sky. The next minute, the weather shifted violently. The temperature dropped like a hammer falling to the ground. A powerful gust of wind hit the truck, making Jake's hands stiff on the wheel as the blizzard began to howl. Snow blasted into the windows, the world outside turning white as the visibility dropped to near zero. He couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and the snowstorm seemed to have no end. Damn it! Jake cursed under his breath, slamming his foot down harder on the accelerator, trying to push the truck forward. But the wheel spun in place, throwing up a cloud of snow as the truck lurched. The blizzard was relentless. Jake's heartbeat pounded in his chest as the wind screamed like a wild animal. Every part of him told him to stop, to pull over and wait for the storm to pass. But Jake knew something that the girls in the back didn't: they couldn't afford to wait. If they stopped now, they might never start moving again. There was a small stretch of road between them and the nearest town, and they were already too far from help. The storm had trapped them. Every mile they drove brought them closer to being buried alive if the truck got stuck. But if they stayed in the storm, they'd be worse off. Jake had no choice. His mind raced, thoughts clashing against the icy cold creeping into his bones. The road was already dangerous, barely recognizable as the snow piled higher and higher against the truck. It was a miracle they had even made it this far. And he had no idea what to do now. The two girls, daughters of a billionaire, sat quietly in the back seat, their breaths shallow, their faces drawn with fear. They were too young to understand how dangerous it was, but they could feel the fear in the air. They clutched each other for warmth, their eyes wide with panic. It wasn't supposed to be this way. They weren't supposed to be here, out in the middle of nowhere, struggling for survival. They were supposed to be on vacation, in a place where their wealth and status protected them from the world outside. They had everything. Money. Luxury. Protection. The kind of life most people would dream of. And yet here they were, stuck in a blizzard, with a man who couldn't even afford to keep his own shop open, trying to get them to safety. Jake stole a quick glance in the rearview mirror. He saw the girls huddling together, the older one holding the younger one close. They were shivering, their eyes filled with uncertainty, but there was a fire in the older girl's gaze, a look of determination that reminded Jake of the fire he used to have. That was before everything fell apart. Before the bankruptcy. Before the divorce. Before the mechanic shop he'd worked so hard to build had crumbled under the weight of debt and bad decisions. He had nothing now. Nothing but this truck. And these girls. Stay calm, Jake muttered under his breath. Stay calm, you've got this. Just keep going. The truck struggled forward, wheels spinning in the snow, but it wasn't enough. The storm was too fierce, the road too slippery. Every few feet, the truck slipped sideways, and Jake's heart skipped a beat each time. The wind howled louder. The snow had turned into a blinding whiteout, the kind that could swallow you whole without anyone ever knowing you were there. Suddenly, the truck skidded sharply to the right. Jake cursed, turning the wheel hard to the left. The tires lost traction, and the truck veered wildly. For a split second, everything went still. Then, with a gut-wrenching jerk, the truck slid completely off the road. The truck's body slammed against the ground, the front end buried deep in a snowbank. Jake's breath caught in his throat, and his heart raced as the vehicle settled, coming to an unexpected and violent stop. He sat there for a moment, frozen, his hands still gripping the steering wheel. The engine sputtered and died, leaving them in an eerie, deafening silence. No, 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 no. Jake shouted as he tried to restart the engine. It churned but refused to turn over. The snowstorm outside raged louder, as if mocking him. There was no power, no warmth. The truck was stuck. He slammed his fist against the dashboard in frustration. "Come on," he yelled. But it was no use. Jake looked out the windshield, at the blinding snowstorm that had consumed the world. He tried to see through the flurry, to make out some sign of hope, but there was nothing. Just white. Endless white. The two girls in the back seat had gone silent. He could hear them breathing, but there was no sound of panic. They knew something was wrong. Jake turned in his seat, his hands shaking as he looked at them. "We're stuck," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "But don't worry. I'll get us out of here." He opened the door and stepped out into the snow. The biting cold slapped him hard across the face, immediately numbing his skin. It was so cold that his breath froze in front of him. He felt his legs weaken as the snow piled up around his boots. He had no idea how long they had been stuck, but the wind was picking up, making it harder and harder to think straight. He looked back at the truck. There was no way to get it out of the snow, not by himself. But the girls, they couldn't stay in there. Jake's mind raced. He needed help, but help was miles away. His only option was to find a way to get them back to the town before the storm got worse. If he could just make it to the road, maybe he could flag someone down. But the wind was so strong that he could barely stand. Every step he took felt like it would be his last. The snow was blinding, and the temperature had dropped even further. Every breath he took seemed to freeze his lungs. It was a battle against nature, and he wasn't sure if he was going to win. The truck was stuck, but there was no way to let the girls know how serious this was without panicking them. He turned back to the truck, his feet dragging through the snow as he made his way back. The storm was so thick that he could barely see anything beyond a few feet in front of him. He reached the truck and opened the door. The girls were still huddled together in the back seat. Their faces were pale, their lips blue, but they had not made a sound. "All right, we've got to get out," Jake said, his voice strained. "We're stuck. But we can't just sit here and wait for help. We have to move." The older girl looked at him, fear and confusion in her eyes. "But, we'll freeze out there." Jake shook his head. "We don't have a choice. It's either stay here and freeze, or we try to make it to the road and hope someone sees us." The younger girl whimpered, clutching her sister tightly. The older girl nodded, and without another word, they unbuckled their seatbelts. Jake helped them out of the truck, and they immediately huddled close to him for warmth. The cold hit them like a wall, and they struggled to stay upright against the wind. Jake didn't hesitate. He pushed forward, his boots sinking deep into the snow. The girls followed closely behind, their steps heavy and unsure. Every few steps, Jake would glance back, making sure they were still there. He had no idea how far they had to go. He didn't know if anyone would find them. But he couldn't stop now. Not when they needed him. The storm raged on. The wind howled like a wild animal. But Jake didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. He couldn't fail them. Not this time. The snow had begun to fall heavier now, each flake a tiny shard of ice that seemed to freeze everything it touched. Jake's legs felt like lead, and the wind cut through his clothes like knives. He gritted his teeth against the pain, his breath coming in short, quick bursts. The freezing air made his skin feel raw, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Behind him, the two girls struggled to keep up. Every few steps, Jake would glance back to make sure they were still following. He had no idea how far they had to go, but it felt like they'd been walking forever. The storm didn't care. It didn't show mercy, it didn't care who they were or where they came from. It had been 20 minutes since they had left the truck, but the world around them had become an endless blur of white. The wind howled, drowning out any other sound, and the only thing Jake could focus on was the faint silhouette of the girl struggling behind him. His mind was racing. He needed to find shelter, but where? The road was nowhere in sight. The storm was so thick now that he couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him. They were trapped in the middle of nowhere with no way of knowing where the nearest help was. His thoughts were scattered. But one thing was clear: if they didn't find shelter soon, they would be in serious trouble. "Jake," the older girl's voice broke through his thoughts. "Jake, we can't go much longer. We're freezing." He turned around, his face grim. The girl's teeth were chattering, her skin pale. She wasn't wrong. He could see it in her eyes. They were exhausted. "Just a little farther," Jake said, his voice hoarse from the cold. "We're going to find somewhere to huddle. Just keep going." The younger girl clutched her sister tightly, and for a moment, Jake felt a pang of guilt. He had promised them safety. He had told them they'd be okay. But he wasn't so sure anymore. The storm had a life of its own, and it didn't care about promises. Every step was harder than the last. The wind howled, biting at their faces, and Jake could feel his strength slowly slipping away. He had been a mechanic his whole life, used to getting his hands dirty, used to dealing with engines and machines. But this was something different. This wasn't about fixing things. It was about survival. And he wasn't sure he was prepared for that. They continued moving through the storm, their progress painfully slow. After what felt like hours, Jake saw a shadow in the distance. It was faint at first, barely visible against the blizzard, but as he squinted through the snow, it became clearer. A building. A faint hope flickered in Jake's chest. He didn't know what kind of building it was, but it didn't matter. Shelter. Warmth. Anything that could offer them a chance. He didn't say anything at first. He just moved toward it, his pace quickening as he reached the end of his strength. His legs felt like they were going to give out at any moment, but he forced himself to keep going. The girls followed, their breaths shallow and labored, their movements slower now, but still determined. They were a little behind him now, but they were still moving. That was all that mattered. When Jake reached the building, he nearly collapsed at the door. The wind howled around him, the snow biting at his skin, but there was something more important now: safety. He turned the door handle, praying it wasn't locked. It creaked open. A gust of warm air hit him in the face, and he stumbled inside, collapsing against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It was a small cabin, simple and weathered. The walls were lined with wood, and the scent of pine filled the air. A single fireplace in the center of the room flickered with the last of its dying embers. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them alive. The girls stumbled in behind him, and Jake quickly closed the door, trapping the storm outside. He breathed a sigh of relief as the cold air was replaced by a damp, warm stillness. The heat from the fireplace wasn't much, but it was better than the freezing cold outside. For a moment, they just stood there, taking in the shelter they had found. Jake sank to the floor, his legs giving out completely. He could hardly move now, his body exhausted from the cold and the exertion of the last few hours. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cabin, they were safe, for now. The older girl collapsed next to him, her eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. "What now?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost lost in the stillness. Jake took a deep breath. "We wait for help. We'll stay here until the storm passes, and then we'll head out." "But what if no one comes?" the younger girl asked, her voice trembling. "What if we're stuck out here forever?" Jake couldn't answer that. The truth was, he didn't know. He had no way of knowing how long the storm would last, or whether they would be able to make it out alive. They were in the middle of nowhere, and every decision he made now could be the difference between life and death. But he wasn't going to let them know that. "We're not stuck," he said, his voice firm, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "We just have to hold on. We'll get through this." The girls nodded, but Jake could see the fear in their eyes. It was the same fear he felt deep in his gut, gnawing at him like a hungry animal. He stood up, shaking with exhaustion, and walked over to the fireplace. The embers had nearly died out, and the room was growing colder again. He needed to find more wood, anything to keep the fire going. He searched around the small cabin and found a stack of firewood near the wall. The logs were dry and ready to burn. He quickly fed a few into the fire, watching as the flames flickered back to life. The warmth in the room grew, though it was still not enough to fully chase the chill from his bones. The girls huddled together near the fire, their eyes closed, their faces pale and tired. Jake sat on the floor next to them, his hands trembling from the cold, but also from something else. It wasn't just the storm he was afraid of. It was what came after. If they didn't get help soon, if the storm didn't pass, they would be in real trouble. They didn't have enough food, and there was no telling how long they would have to stay here. The storm could last for days, for all he knew. Jake looked out the window, his eyes straining against the snow and the dark. There was no sign of anything. No other houses. No roads. Just endless white. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He wasn't supposed to be here, trying to save two young girls from a storm that was beyond anyone's control. He was just a mechanic. Just a man with a broken life, trying to survive. But now, he was responsible for them. He had made a promise to get them to safety, and he wasn't going to let them down. He had to find a way. There was no other choice. The night stretched on, an endless expanse of cold and uncertainty. The fire flickered weakly in the corner of the small cabin, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. Jake sat by the fire, staring into the flames as if they could offer him answers. His thoughts were a whirlwind of worry, exhaustion, and fear. The storm outside showed no signs of letting up. The howling wind had become a constant companion, its relentless screeching filling the silence inside the cabin. Snow continued to fall in thick, heavy layers, blurring the world beyond the small window. They were trapped. No road, no path, no sign of life anywhere. Jake couldn't shake the nagging feeling in his gut that things were about to get worse. He glanced over at the girls. They had huddled together for warmth, their small forms curled up near the fire, their faces pale and drained. The older girl, Olivia, had her arm wrapped around her younger sister, Lily, trying to offer some comfort, though both of them seemed beyond the point of exhaustion. Their once bright eyes had dimmed, the fear and cold creeping into their bones. Jake wanted to do more. He wanted to fix this. He had always been the type of person who fixed things. But now, nothing seemed fixable. What if no one finds us? Lily's voice broke through the silence, fragile and small. Jake turned to look at her. Her wide, frightened eyes met his. "I promise, someone will come," Jake said, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince more, Lily or himself. But the truth was, he didn't know. He didn't know if anyone would find them. He didn't know if help was even possible in this storm. The blizzard was relentless, and even though they had managed to find shelter, the danger was far from over. The fire crackled, sending small embers flying into the air. Jake leaned forward, poking at the fire with a stick, watching as the flames danced around the logs. The warmth was a small comfort in an otherwise unforgiving world. Olivia shifted beside him, her voice barely audible. "Jake, what if we don't make it? What if we never get out of here?" The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Jake didn't know how to answer. He didn't want to give up hope, but the harsh reality of the situation was starting to settle in. They were alone in the middle of nowhere, miles from any civilization, surrounded by a blizzard that showed no signs of stopping. The odds were stacked against them. But giving up wasn't an option. Not yet. "We'll make it," Jake said, his voice firm but strained. "We have to. We've come this far. We can't stop now." Olivia nodded, but Jake could see the doubt in her eyes. She was trying to be strong for her sister, but he could tell she was struggling. The cold was wearing them down, and the uncertainty was eating away at them all. Lily shivered, drawing her knees up to her chest, and Jake's heart clenched at the sight. They were so young. They shouldn't be here. None of them should be out in this storm. But here they were, caught in the middle of nature's fury. How long do you think the storm will last? Olivia asked, her voice trembling. Jake sighed. I don't know. It could pass by morning. Or it could last for days. The uncertainty of it all made his chest tighten. He had no way of knowing. There were too many variables, too many things beyond his control. He could only hope that they would make it through. He stood up, stretching his stiff limbs, and walked over to the small window. The snow had piled up against the cabin, and the world outside was a blur of white. He couldn't see anything. No movement, no lights in the distance, nothing. Just snow. The silence outside was deafening. The wind had died down a little, but it still howled intermittently, as if mocking their helplessness. Jake stared out into the storm, his mind racing. He needed to do something. He couldn't just sit here and wait. Not with their lives on the line. I'm going to go out and check for help, he said suddenly, turning to face Olivia and Lily. Both girls looked at him in shock. What? Olivia asked, her voice sharp with concern. Jake, it's dangerous out there. You can't. I have to, he interrupted, his tone more desperate than he intended. I can't just sit here and wait. I have to try. No, Olivia insisted, standing up. You're not going out there. We'll be trapped even worse if you get lost or hurt. Jake took a step closer, his face tense. I'm not going to get lost, he said firmly. I'll stay close. Just to see if there's anything nearby. If I don't come back soon, you'll know something's wrong. Olivia's eyes were wide with fear, but she didn't say anything for a moment. Her gaze flickered to Lily, who was clutching her sister's sleeve tightly, her face pale with fear. We're stuck here anyway, Jake continued. If I don't at least try, we're all going to die in this cabin. We need help. I have to go. Olivia looked at him for a long moment, the fear in her eyes slowly giving way to reluctant understanding. Okay, she whispered, almost too quietly. But please, please be careful. I will, Jake said, his voice low but determined. He turned toward the door, his breath quickening in his chest. He knew it was a risky decision. He knew he could get lost, or worse, freeze to death in the storm. But staying in the cabin wasn't an option anymore. They were running out of supplies, and the fire wouldn't last forever. He couldn't let them down. Jake pulled on his jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and opened the door. The cold hit him like a slap in the face. The wind howled, pushing him back with its force. But he stood firm, pressing forward, one step at a time. The snow was deep, almost up to his knees now. It was hard to see more than a few feet in front of him, but he kept moving, using the flashlight to guide his way through the blizzard. He had no idea what he was looking for, no idea where help might be. But he couldn't let the girls down. He couldn't let them freeze in that cabin. Jake's breath came in short gasps as he trudged through the snow. The cold seeped into his bones, but he forced himself to keep going, each step a battle against the storm. He was determined to find something, anything, that could give them a chance. Minutes stretched into hours. He lost track of time as the snow piled higher and higher around him, the wind pushing him from side to side. He had no idea where he was going anymore. His legs ached, his feet were numb, and his hands were stiff from the cold. But he kept going. There was no turning back now. Then, as if by some miracle, he saw something in the distance. A faint glow through the snow. A light. It was faint, barely visible, but it was there. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? He pushed forward, his legs screaming in protest, until he finally reached the source of the light. A cabin. Another cabin. His heart pounded in his chest as he pounded on the door, shouting, "Help! Help!" For a moment, there was nothing. Then the door creaked open, and a figure appeared in the doorway. Jake's eyes widened with disbelief. "Who are you?" the man asked, his voice thick with the accent of someone who had been living alone for far too long. I need help," Jake said, gasping for breath. "There are 2 girls with me. They're trapped in a cabin. Please, you have to help." The man studied Jake for a moment before stepping aside, motioning for him to enter. Jake stumbled inside, feeling the warmth of the fire hit him like a wave. He had found help. The warmth of the small cabin enveloped Jake as he stepped inside, his body shaking from the cold. He had made it, he had actually made it to another cabin. He collapsed onto the floor, the exhaustion overwhelming him. The harsh winds and freezing temperatures had drained every ounce of his strength, but he couldn't allow himself to rest just yet. The girls were still out there, still in danger. The man who had opened the door stared at Jake, his eyes filled with skepticism. His face was rough, weathered by years of solitude, and his clothes were worn and patched together as if he hadn't seen a town in ages. Jake couldn't help but wonder who this man was, living alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but the relentless storm. "Who are you?" the man asked again, his voice deep and gravelly. "What are you doing out here in this mess?" Jake wiped his face, his heart racing as he fought to stay conscious. He needed to stay focused. "I'm Jake. I was trying to get help for 2 girls. They're stuck in a cabin a few miles away. They're trapped in this storm. Please, you have to help." The man's gaze softened for a moment, and Jake noticed a flicker of something in his eyes, sympathy, maybe? But it was quickly replaced by suspicion. "A couple of girls, you say?" the man muttered, his voice low. "In the middle of a blizzard, no less. That's a bad situation, son." Jake nodded, his throat dry. "I know. I didn't know who else to turn to. I couldn't just leave them there." The man stared at him for a long moment, sizing him up. Jake could feel the tension in the air, the man's calculating gaze assessing whether he could trust Jake or not. The storm outside howled louder, and the cabin's walls groaned under the weight of the wind, but it was the silence inside that felt heavier. "All right," the man finally said, breaking the stillness. "I'll help you, but we're not going out there until the storm dies down. No sense in both of us getting lost out there." Jake's heart sank, but he knew the man was right. They couldn't risk going back out into the blizzard, not in these conditions. The storm was fierce, and it was only getting worse. If he went back out now, he might not make it back. But what about the girls? He couldn't leave them alone for too much longer. "Thank you," Jake said, his voice cracking with relief. He sat down on a rickety chair near the fire, his mind racing with questions. Who was this man, and how had he ended up all the way out here? What kind of person could survive in such isolation, alone in the middle of nowhere? The man didn't offer any answers. Instead, he just turned to the stove, stoking the fire and adding more wood. Jake sat quietly, watching the flames flicker and dance. The warmth was a small comfort, but it didn't erase the fear gnawing at his mind. He could only imagine what Olivia and Lily were going through in the other cabin, waiting for help that might never come. Hours passed. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cabin, it was quiet. Too quiet. Jake's mind kept returning to the girls, to the cold, to the fear. They had already been out there for too long. What if they couldn't hold on? What if they were already gone? He shook his head, trying to banish the thought. He couldn't think like that. He had to stay focused. They were still alive. They had to be. The man finally broke the silence. "You don't look like a mechanic," he said suddenly, his tone almost amused. Jake blinked, surprised by the comment. "I'm not. Not anymore. I used to work at a shop, but that was before, well, before everything went wrong." The man raised an eyebrow, then nodded as if he understood more than he let on. "That so? Well, you seem like a determined fella. I'll give you that. Most people would have given up by now." Jake smiled weakly. "I don't have that luxury. Those girls, they're counting on me. I couldn't just leave them." The man said nothing, just nodded again and went back to tending the fire. Jake sat there, lost in his thoughts. The hours dragged on, and his exhaustion began to take its toll. He could feel his eyes getting heavy, his mind drifting in and out of focus. The warmth of the fire was starting to lull him into a sense of security. For the first time in hours, Jake allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment, his body craving rest. But sleep didn't come. Instead, his mind filled with visions of Olivia and Lily, their faces pale with fear, their eyes filled with uncertainty. What if they were already too weak to survive? What if the storm never stopped? He had to do something. He couldn't wait any longer. He opened his eyes and looked over at the man. "We need to go. We need to get those girls out of there." The man didn't look up. "It's still too dangerous," he said calmly. "We wait. That's the only option." Jake's frustration bubbled over. "I don't care how dangerous it is. They need us. We can't just sit here and wait for the storm to kill them." The man finally looked at him, his eyes calm but firm. "I've lived here a long time, son. I've seen storms like this before. You can't rush it. You'll only get yourself killed." Jake's chest tightened with the weight of the man's words. He knew the man was right. Rushing out there in the middle of the storm would be a death sentence. But he couldn't just sit around, knowing that the girls were still out there, alone, vulnerable. He sat back in his chair, breathing heavily, his mind racing. What was the right thing to do? Was it worth the risk to go out now, or should he wait for the storm to pass? Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity. Finally, the man stood up. "All right, I'll go with you. But we wait until first light. That's the best chance we've got." Jake nodded, relieved that the man had agreed to help. But the tension in his chest didn't ease. He couldn't shake the image of Olivia and Lily, trapped in that cabin, waiting for help that might never come. The storm outside was unforgiving, and Jake wasn't sure how long either of them could hold on. "Thank you," Jake said, his voice low. "You don't know what this means to me." The man didn't respond. He just moved to the other side of the cabin, where a small cot was set up. He lay down, pulling a thick blanket over himself, his back to Jake. Jake stayed awake for hours, listening to the storm outside, his mind turning over every possibility. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had done everything he could. Now, all he could do was wait. Wait for daylight. Wait for the chance to go back to the girls. He closed his eyes, his body aching with exhaustion, but his mind never stopped racing. The storm outside raged on, a constant reminder that time was running out. The girls needed him. He had to get to them. The first rays of light pierced through the cracks in the cabin's walls, casting long, eerie shadows on the wooden floor. Jake awoke with a start, the chill of the night still lingering in the air. He hadn't slept a wink. His mind had raced all night, imagining worst-case scenarios, replaying his every decision in his head. The storm had raged on for hours, but now, the winds had started to die down. The snow was still thick, but the sky was clearer. It was a sign that the storm might finally be easing. Jake quickly sat up, his muscles stiff and sore from the cold and exhaustion. He glanced over at the man, still sound asleep, his face hidden beneath the blanket. For a moment, Jake considered waking him, but the man had made it clear last night that they weren't leaving until first light. Well, that light had arrived. He stood up, stumbling slightly as his legs struggled to carry him, and walked over to the door. The outside world was a blur of white. The snow had accumulated in thick layers, making the ground almost invisible. But it was quieter now, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jake could hear the world outside without the deafening howl of the storm. It was a small relief, but it didn't change the fact that the girls were still out there, somewhere, in the middle of all this. He reached for his coat, the fabric stiff with cold, and pulled it on. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. The man had offered no help, no gear for the journey, and Jake hadn't had the time or energy to gather anything useful. He had been focused on one thing only, getting to the girls, no matter the cost. Turning to the man one last time, Jake whispered, "I'm going." The man stirred, lifting his head slowly. His eyes were heavy, filled with the weariness of someone who had long since given up on sleep, but there was no mistaking the concern in his gaze. "You're really going?" he asked, his voice rough from sleep. Jake nodded firmly. "I have to. They're waiting. I can't just leave them out there." The man said nothing, just watched as Jake opened the door and stepped out into the world beyond. The cold hit him like a slap to the face. It wasn't just the freezing air, it was the realization that he was alone again, venturing into the wilderness with nothing but his determination to guide him. The man had given him nothing, no tools, no advice, no further assistance. Jake was on his own. The snow had piled up deep in the yard, nearly waist-high in places. Each step he took felt like a battle, his legs burning with every inch of progress. The wind was still biting, but nowhere near as ferocious as it had been during the height of the storm. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jake plowed through the snow, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't afford to waste any time. Every minute spent out here was another minute the girls were exposed to the harsh elements. It felt like an eternity since he had left them, but he couldn't dwell on that now. The only thing that mattered was getting to them. He made it about halfway through the snowdrifts before his legs started to give out. The exhaustion was starting to catch up to him. His chest heaved with every breath, and his muscles screamed in protest. He had to keep moving. He had to. A sharp crack of ice made him stop in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. His heart skipped a beat. What was that sound? Was it the storm picking up again? Jake looked around, but there was nothing but the thick white fog of snow and ice. The world felt empty, vast, and endless. He forced himself to take a deep breath and kept walking, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the storm kicked back into full force. The winds howled again, louder than ever before, and the snow began to fall harder. It was as though the blizzard was hell-bent on testing his resolve. Jake pulled his scarf tighter around his face and kept going, each step more difficult than the last. He had no choice. He couldn't stop now. He had come too far. The girls were counting on him. He wasn't sure how long he had been walking when he finally spotted the faint outline of the cabin through the falling snow. The familiar shape seemed so small against the vastness of the snow-covered landscape, but it was there, standing just as he remembered it. His heart surged with hope. But as he drew closer, he realized something wasn't right. The cabin looked abandoned. The door was slightly ajar, and the windows were dark, devoid of any light. His pulse quickened. Had the girls already left? Had something happened to them? Jake's heart raced as he stumbled forward, his legs nearly giving out from under him. His feet sank deep into the snow, but he pushed forward, determined to reach the door. When he reached the entrance, he paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob. His breath was shallow, his chest tight with anticipation. The storm had once again picked up, making it impossible to hear anything from inside the cabin. He reached for the door and pushed it open, the sound of creaking wood echoing in the silence. The moment he stepped inside, a wave of cold hit him. The cabin was empty, eerily so. There was no sign of the girls. No sign of anyone. The fire that had once been burning was now nothing more than cold embers. The floor was littered with empty cans and bits of broken furniture. It looked like a place that had been abandoned for days. Jake's mind raced. What had happened? Where were they? He took a few cautious steps forward, scanning the room. His eyes darted to every corner, but there was no sign of life. The silence in the cabin was suffocating. He was just about to turn back and retrace his steps when something caught his eye, a small, crumpled piece of paper, half hidden under a chair. He bent down and picked it up, his hands trembling as he unfolded it. The paper was old, yellowed with age, but the writing on it was still legible. It was a note. "Help is coming," the note read in neat, hurried handwriting. "We're safe for now. Don't worry about us." Jake's heart dropped. Safe? How could they be safe? The storm was still raging outside, and they couldn't have left. Not without help. He scanned the room again, feeling a pang of panic rise in his chest. The note had been left behind in a hurry, but it didn't make sense. If the girls were safe, why had they left this cryptic message? Then, the answer hit him like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just the girls who were in danger, it was him too. Something was off, and it was only a matter of time before he uncovered the truth. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps outside broke his train of thought. Jake's heart skipped a beat. Was it the girls? Was someone else coming for him? He rushed to the window, peering out through the snow-covered glass. A figure appeared on the horizon, moving steadily toward the cabin. And then, as the figure drew closer, Jake recognized him. It was the man from the cabin. The one who had refused to help. But why was he coming now? What did he know? Jake's mind raced. There was more to this story than he had ever realized. Jake stood by the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he watched the figure outside approach. The snow was thick, but the figure's silhouette was unmistakable, the man who had offered no help and yet had been watching him from a distance for far too long. What was going on? Why had the man refused to help him earlier? Why was he coming back now, and most importantly, where were the girls? Every instinct Jake had screamed for him to leave, to run out the back door, to find the girls before it was too late. But he was tired. Tired of running, tired of feeling helpless. Something didn't add up, and this man had to know more. The footsteps grew louder, crunching in the snow. It was almost as if the man wanted to be heard. Why hadn't he just come in quietly if his intentions were peaceful? Jake felt the tension in his shoulders rise, but he refused to back down. He had come too far, risked too much. He wouldn't let the answers slip away. Not now. Not when they were so close. With one last look at the note left behind by the girls, Jake turned and walked toward the door. His hands were cold, and his legs ached, but he pushed through the pain. He had no choice. The man was at the door now, and Jake had no choice but to face him. When he opened it, the man stood there, covered in snow, his face unreadable. The storm had subsided somewhat, but the air was still bitterly cold. Jake couldn't read his expression. Was it fear? Was it guilt? The man stood there for a moment, almost as if waiting for Jake to speak first. But Jake wasn't going to wait any longer. He stepped forward, his voice firm, cutting through the silence. "Where are the girls?" The man's eyes flickered for just a second. There was something there. Something that Jake couldn't quite place. It was guilt, yes, but also something darker. The man hesitated, looking past Jake, his eyes shifting toward the cabin behind him. "They're safe," the man said, his voice strained, like he was forcing the words out. Jake clenched his fists, his patience wearing thin. "Safe?" he spat, incredulous. "If they're so safe, why aren't they here? Why did you leave them out there?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he let out a long sigh, stepping into the cabin without waiting for an invitation. He brushed snow off his shoulders, but Jake could see the hesitation in his movements. "You don't understand," the man muttered under his breath. "This is bigger than you think." Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Bigger than me?" he asked, taking a step closer. "I don't care how big it is. I'm here for the girls. I'm not leaving without them." The man seemed to consider this for a moment, before turning back to Jake, his face filled with a mixture of reluctance and resolve. "All right. I'll tell you everything. But you won't like it." Jake swallowed hard. His heart raced in his chest. He had been expecting something, anything, but he had no idea that the truth would be far more complex than he could have imagined. "Sit down," the man said, motioning to the chairs by the fire. His tone was final, as if he knew that once the words left his mouth, there would be no going back. Jake sat. He needed answers, even if he didn't know what he was about to hear. The man took a deep breath, rubbing his eyes as if trying to shake off a lingering weight. His voice was low, almost as if speaking the words aloud would make them more real. "They're not who you think they are," the man began, his eyes locking with Jake's. "The girls, they're not just any kids stranded in a storm. They're important. Their lives are more than just survival." Jake blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean?" "They're royalty," the man said simply, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Jake's world tilted. He sat back in his chair, unable to process what he had just heard. "What?" he whispered, disbelief written all over his face. "They're royal heirs," the man continued, his voice almost hollow. "From a distant planet. Their family's empire is vast. And they've been hiding here, on Earth, because their enemies want them dead." Jake felt his stomach drop. He had heard a lot of wild things in his life, but this? This sounded like something straight out of a science fiction novel. But the man's expression was serious. Too serious. "No," Jake said, shaking his head. "I don't believe you. You expect me to buy that?" The man's eyes softened. "I wish I were lying. I wish I were making this all up. But I'm not." He stood up then, pacing in front of the fire, his hands running through his hair. "I was hired to protect them. I've been watching them for years. But I can't keep them safe forever. The storm, the blizzard, it was a distraction. A cover. While their enemies were getting closer." Jake's mind was spinning. He was starting to understand something, maybe more than he ever wanted to. "So, you knew all along?" Jake asked, his voice rising with anger. "You knew who they were, and you still left them out there? You didn't even try to help me find them?" The man's face darkened. "I didn't leave them, I couldn't. The truth is, if anyone finds out who they really are, they'll stop at nothing to take them. And you, Jake, you're in danger too now." The words hit like a punch to the gut. "Me?" Jake choked out. "What do you mean I'm in danger?" The man stopped pacing, his eyes fixed on Jake with a hard intensity. "I'm not the only one watching you. The people looking for them, they know you helped them. They know you're involved now." Jake stood up, his hands trembling. "What do we do now?" The man turned and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small metallic device. He pressed a button on it, and suddenly the room was filled with a low hum. A hologram of the girls appeared in front of them, their faces serious but undeniably royal. "These are the girls," the man said, his voice grave. And this is their message to you, Jake. You need to listen carefully. The hologram flickered for a moment before speaking. The girls' voices were calm, though Jake could hear the fear beneath the surface. We're safe for now, but we need your help, one of them said. You're the only one who can get us out of here. The people chasing us are closer than ever, and they'll stop at nothing. Jake's heart skipped a beat. They were alive. They had made it. But what had he gotten himself into? The other girl's voice joined in. The truth is bigger than you know. We can't hide anymore. But we can't do this without you. The hologram flickered one last time and then vanished, leaving only silence in its wake. Jake felt a lump form in his throat. The girls weren't just innocent bystanders in all this. They were part of something much larger, something dangerous. And now, so was he. The man turned to Jake, his expression grim. We don't have much time. They've already located us. You'll need to make a choice, Jake. The path you take from here will determine everything. Jake stared at him, his mind racing. The girls were counting on him. The weight of their lives, and the truth of their situation, hung heavy in the air. The man was right, Jake had a choice to make. He could walk away, live his life, forget this whole ordeal. Or he could step up, protect the girls, and face the dangers ahead. The decision was his. And whatever choice he made, there would be no turning back. Jake learns the shocking truth: the girls aren't just ordinary children, they're royal heirs from another planet, caught in a battle for their lives. With danger closing in, Jake must decide whether to protect them or walk away. This revelation forces him to confront not only the danger they face but also the risks he's willing to take for the people he's come to care about. The story ends on a cliffhanger, leaving readers to question what will happen next in this dangerous and thrilling adventure.